4 bombs, 2 pilots, a weapon that had never been used in combat, and a single phone call hours later telling the President of the United States they had just killed Saddam Hussein. They hadn't. On March 19th, 2003, the United States tried to end the Iraq War before it started. The target was a compound along the Tigris River south of Baghdad called Dora Farms. A CIA informant inside Saddam's own security detail had said the dictator would be sleeping there that night along with his 2 sons. If the intelligence was right, a single strike could kill all 3 of them and make the invasion unnecessary. The intelligence wasn't right. Not exactly. What happened over the next 6 hours is one of the strangest operations in modern American military history. A president making the biggest decision of his life in under 60 minutes. A stealth fighter taking off with bombs that had been certified for use only hours earlier. A pilot rebooting a computerized bomb with the instruction manual in his lap, 30,000 feet above Iraq. And at the end of it, a crater where a palace used to be, 1 dead civilian, and a ghost on Iraqi television the next afternoon. I've spent weeks on this one, and I still think the strangest part is how close it came to working. Here's what actually happened. On March 17, 2003, George W. Bush gave Saddam Hussein an ultimatum. Leave Iraq in 48 hours, take Uday and Qusay, or face war. The speech was 12 minutes long. Bush delivered it from the White House in a dark blue suit, looking directly into the camera. His tone was not angry, it was almost patient. The kind of patience a man uses when the decision has already been made and he is simply waiting for the formality to end. Because it had been made, weeks earlier. Over 200,000 American and British troops were already in position around Iraq. CIA paramilitary teams had been operating inside the country for months. Aircraft carriers sat in the Persian Gulf. The target list had been refined. The invasion plan had a name. Everyone who needed to know the war was coming already knew. What the ultimatum did was start a timer. 48 hours, down to 0. When the clock hit 0, the bombs would fall on Baghdad. Saddam gave his own speech the next day, defiant, promising Iraq would fight to the last man. He did not leave. His sons did not leave. Nobody in the Bush administration expected them to. So the countdown ran. In Baghdad, the city felt the way cities feel before they know something is coming. Shops closed early. Families stocked bottled water and kerosene. Anti-aircraft guns appeared on the roofs of ministries. Republican Guard units took up positions around the capital. Iraqi state television kept broadcasting, showing old propaganda films and speeches. On March 18th, Hans Blix pulled his weapons inspectors out of Iraq. For months, UN teams had searched for the weapons of mass destruction the Bush administration insisted were there. They had found nothing. Their presence had been the last thin layer of diplomatic cover, and now even that was gone. Back in Langley, Virginia, at CIA headquarters, a man named Luis Rueda ran the agency's operations inside Iraq. Rueda is not a name most Americans know. For the 3 weeks that mattered most, he was one of the people with the clearest picture of what was actually happening inside the country. His teams had been building a human intelligence network for years, informants across Iraq, a handful of them inside Saddam's own security apparatus. The CIA called them rock stars, and they were about to change the opening night of the war in a way nobody had planned for. On the afternoon of March 19th, with less than a day left on Bush's deadline, one of those rock stars picked up a telephone inside Baghdad and called his handler. What he said would send Donald Rumsfeld and George Tenet sprinting into the Oval Office. His job was to get the rooms ready before Saddam arrived. Fresh sheets, working phones, the right food in the kitchen, the right people at the gates. If something was wrong when the Iraqi president walked into a residence, it was his neck on the line, so he paid attention to everything. Where Saddam slept, who came with him, what time he left, and somewhere along the way, he started telling the CIA. His name was Rokan, and he ran security and logistics at Dora Farms, a family compound along the Tigris River on the southern edge of Baghdad. The estate belonged to Sajida Talfa, Saddam's first wife, and it had been in the family for decades. Orchards, date palms, low stucco buildings, a main palace behind a wall topped with electrified wire. The kind of place a dictator goes when he wants to disappear for a few days. Rokan had been there for years. He knew Saddam's patterns, the bodyguards, the vehicles that preceded the convoy, the hours of preparation the staff needed before the president arrived. That kind of access does not show up on an organizational chart, and in CIA terminology, it made him priceless. The Rockstar network was one of the best-kept secrets of the pre-war period. Most of the assets inside it were not high-level officials. They were the people around the officials: drivers, communications technicians, household staff, men who fixed phone lines and organized security schedules and ran errands for generals, the people who see everything and are paid almost nothing. In northern Iraq, inside a small operations hut codenamed Pistachio, a CIA officer named Tim handled the reporting. Up in the mountains above him, another position called Jonestown relayed incoming calls. When a rock star somewhere in Iraq picked up a phone, the information moved through Jonestown, down to Pistachio, and into Langley, often within the hour. I find this part almost surreal when you stop to think about it. While Colin Powell was at the United Nations holding up a small vial of white powder, warning the world about weapons programs that would turn out not to exist, the actual best human intelligence America had inside Iraq was coming from a man whose job was to make up the guest rooms. On the afternoon of March 19th, Roken made a call. Uday and Qusay were at Dora Farms. He had seen them himself. Communications equipment was being installed, the kind that only appeared when the president was coming. A protective detail had arrived. Security vehicles were parked under the palm trees, hidden from overhead view. Saddam was expected sometime between 1 and 3 in the morning. He would be gone by sunrise. The report went up the chain in Langley and landed on Luis Rueda's desk. Rueda had been trying to catch a nap on his office couch. He was in jeans. It had been a long morning. Someone walked in and said, "Look at this." He read the report, then started making calls. The CIA ordered overhead reconnaissance to confirm. Satellites and drones pointed at Dora Farms and pulled images. What they saw matched what Roken had described: security vehicles, signs of preparation, the specific signature of a presidential visit in progress. By 12:30 Washington time, Rueda's people had produced a full diagram of the compound in 20 minutes. Buildings, distances, likely sleeping quarters. The request had gone out, and somewhere inside the building a team had just conjured, from scratch, a precise architectural breakdown of a private Iraqi estate. That is what the agency can produce when it decides to. Rueda and his team drove across the Potomac to brief Donald Rumsfeld. Then they went to the White House. That is when it got complicated, because one of the later reports from the Rockstars mentioned a word. An Arabic word, manzul. Manzul can mean a place of refuge. It can also mean a basement, or a bunker. If Saddam was sleeping in a bunker underneath Dora Farms, cruise missiles would not be enough. Tomahawks are precision weapons, but they detonate on or near the surface. A hardened underground structure would shrug them off. To actually kill Saddam, you would need to put something through the roof and deep into the ground. You would need a bunker buster. And to deliver a bunker buster into the middle of Baghdad, you would need a stealth aircraft willing to fly into one of the most heavily defended airspaces in the world at a time of day when stealth aircraft are not supposed to fly. George Tenet and Donald Rumsfeld walked into the Oval Office with a hand-drawn map and maybe the best time-sensitive intelligence the CIA had ever produced on a sitting enemy leader. The president asked how sure they were. There is a kind of meeting where the outcome is already decided before the door opens, and there is another kind where nobody knows what the answer will be, and the man who has to decide is the only person in the room nobody can override. This was the second kind. It was early afternoon in Washington on March 19th. In the Oval Office, George W. Bush was being handed a decision nobody had planned for him to make. His war plan was designed around a specific opening. Ground forces first, then air, sequenced, rehearsed, locked in for months. And now, less than 12 hours before the first troops were supposed to move, the CIA was telling him that if he was willing to throw the entire plan into the air, he might be able to kill Saddam Hussein in his sleep. The room filled quickly. Dick Cheney, Donald Rumsfeld, Condoleezza Rice, Colin Powell, General Richard Myers, chairman of the Joint Chiefs, George Tenet from the CIA, Luis Rueda, who had briefed Rumsfeld at the Pentagon less than an hour earlier. Tenet laid out what they had: a rockstar source with direct access to Saddam's movements, confirmation that Uday and Qusay were already at Dora Farms, overhead imagery showing security vehicles hidden under the trees, a time window, 1 to 3 in the morning Baghdad time, when Saddam was expected to be asleep on the property. Then came the caveat. Tenet said, and I quote him directly here, "It's as good as it gets. I can't give you 100% assurance, but this is as good as it gets." The president started asking questions. He wanted to know about the sources. How many were there? How were they vetted? Had they been wrong before? What was the possibility of deception? If Saddam thought the Americans had penetrated his inner circle, could he be feeding the CIA false locations on purpose? Rueda answered as best he could. He put a number on his confidence. He did not want to say 100% because nothing in intelligence work ever is, but he said he believed the strike was worth taking. Around the room, the senior advisors agreed. Colin Powell, who had spent months warning Bush about the costs of invasion, said the line that surprised some people later: "If we've got a chance to decapitate them, it's worth it." The risks were not small. If the strike failed, the United States would have tipped its hand before the invasion even started. Saddam would know the exact moment the war had begun and would have hours to disperse his military, protect his command centers, and prepare for what came next. The carefully designed opening of Operation Iraqi Freedom would be gone. If the strike succeeded, the war might not happen at all. There was also the problem of the bunker. Tennett's team had flagged the word Manzul in the later reports, and Bush understood what it meant. Cruise missiles alone would not be enough. He asked General Myers directly, could the Air Force get a stealth fighter over Baghdad with a bunker buster in time to hit the target before dawn? Myers picked up a secure phone and called General Tommy Franks, the CENTCOM commander running the war from his forward headquarters in Qatar. Franks did not know anything about Dora Farms when the call came in. He had been working on the planned opening of the invasion. Myers explained the situation. Franks said no. "We don't have the F-117 ready to go." Then he paused and said, "Let me check." Here's the part nobody in the Oval Office knew. At Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar, the Air Force had been quietly following the same intelligence the CIA was processing. The 8th Expeditionary Fighter Squadron had already started preparing aircraft that morning. They had not been formally tasked yet, but somebody with foresight had decided to get the planes ready, just in case. When Franks went back to his planners and asked the question, the answer came back almost immediately: yes, we can fly this. He called Washington back. It is possible. The room shifted. The conversation turned from whether the intelligence was good enough to whether the operation was feasible. Myers told Bush the physics. The F-117S would need to take off from Al Udeid no later than 3:30 Qatar time. They would need to be over the target by 5:30 Baghdad time. Any later, and the pilots would be flying into Iraq in full daylight, in aircraft built to hide in the dark. Then Myers said the sentence that compressed the whole decision. "Tom, I need your drop-dead, no-shit decision time," Franks replied. The president had until 3:15 Qatar time to give the order. After that, the pilots could not take off soon enough to be home before daylight. Bush did what he often did in the hardest moments. He asked everybody else to leave the room, everybody except Dick Cheney. We do not know everything that was said in those minutes, because the only two people in the room were the president and the vice president, and neither has ever fully described the exchange. But Bob Woodward, who interviewed most of the principals for his book Plan of Attack, reported that Cheney pushed hard for the strike. Cheney, according to Woodward's sources, told Bush, "This is the best intelligence we've had yet on where Saddam's located." Woodward, in his later reporting, described a pattern Powell had noticed inside the Bush White House. The big decisions, the ones that really mattered, tended to be finalized in those private minutes between Bush and the vice president. I will not pretend to know exactly how much weight Cheney's recommendation carried. Bush had already heard everyone else say yes. Even without Cheney, the room had leaned toward the strike. But there is something about the image of it, the door closing, the staff pulled out, the quiet minutes when two men make a decision that will start a war, that tells you something important about how this administration actually worked. The door opened. Bush had made his call. He ordered the strike to wait until his 48-hour ultimatum expired. The deadline ran out at 8 p.m. Washington time, which was 4 a.m. in Baghdad. The bombs could not fall before then. He would not be seen going back on his word to the world. That decision would cost them, because according to Rokin's reporting, Saddam was supposed to be at Dora Farms from 1 to 3 in the morning Baghdad time. The ultimatum expired at 4. By the time the F-117S reached the target, the man they were trying to kill might already be in a car heading somewhere else. Rueda saw it immediately. He said it plainly, years later, in interviews. Waiting for the deadline basically meant that we were not going to get Saddam. It was just after 1 in the afternoon in Washington, just after 9 in the evening in Baghdad. At Al Udeid, in Qatar, two pilots named David Toomey and Mark Hone had no idea they were about to fly the strangest mission of their lives. They were about to find out Major Mark Hone was already strapped into the cockpit of his F-117 Nighthawk when the ground crew was still tightening the last lugs on his bombs. That is not how you prepare a stealth fighter for combat. A normal mission takes 6 hours to plan and load. Hone had 3. He and Lieutenant Colonel David Toomey had been reviewing targets for the planned air campaign. Then the call came from the Combined Air Operations Center in Saudi Arabia, and their mission flipped. Go get Saddam. The weapon was called the EGBU-27, a 2,000-pound bunker buster, upgraded with GPS guidance so it could hit coordinates in any weather. It had never been used in combat. Worse, the Nighthawk had never been certified to carry 2 of them at once. That certification was signed off at Edwards Air Force Base in California 6 hours before the mission tasking came in. 6 hours. Hoyne called it dumb luck. There was more. Somebody on base had already loaded 2 of the new bombs onto one of the aircraft as a demonstration. A show and tell, to show senior officers what the weapon looked like on the jet. That show and tell was now a combat loadout. You look at a sequence of coincidences like that, and you start to wonder whether the universe was setting up the mission to succeed. But the universe had a sense of humor about the whole thing, because almost everything else that could go wrong would. At 3:38 in the morning, Qatar time, Toomey and Hone lit their engines and took off. 45 Tomahawk cruise missiles launched from Navy ships in the Persian Gulf and the Red Sea around the same hour. The F-117 is designed to hide in the dark. In daylight, it is a slow, ugly, defenseless target. Toomey and Hone were racing the sun. On the climb out of Qatar, Hoyne's encrypted radio failed. He was flying toward a target deep inside enemy territory, with no way to confirm the mission was still on, or hear if it had been aborted. When the Nighthawks met their refueling tankers over western Iraq, Hoyne connected his aircraft to the tanker's boom. The boom has an intercom line. That gave him a physical voice connection to the tanker crew. He asked them to check with command. The mission was still on. Meanwhile, Toomey had his own problem. The GPS on one of his bombs died in flight. So Toomey did something you will not read about in many accounts of modern American warfare. He pulled out the instruction manual. The weapon was so new it came with printed documentation, and Toomey had kept his copy in the cockpit. He worked through the reboot procedure by hand, reading the steps, restarting the computer on the bomb, and hoping it would come back up. It did. The 2 Nighthawks approached Baghdad from different vectors, Toomey from the east, Hone from the west. Around them, more than 30 American support aircraft were already airborne. For weeks, the Pentagon had been quietly intensifying American flights over southern Iraq, so that Iraqi radar operators were used to seeing American jets in their airspace, and had stopped looking for anything unusual. Nobody in Baghdad had realized it was a plan. The sun was coming up as they approached Dora Farms. Low clouds hung over the city. Laser guidance was not going to work through them. The enhanced bomb, the one with the satellite chip added, was the only weapon on the aircraft that could. The bomb nobody had ever tested in combat was about to do the one thing no other weapon on the mission could do. At the last possible moment, a break opened in the clouds. 6 seconds. That was the window Toomey and Hoyne got to visually identify the target and drop. 6 seconds. 4 bombs released, 2 from each aircraft. The bombs fell at 5:36 in the morning, Baghdad time, 13 minutes after dawn. The 2 Nighthawks turned south toward Qatar. They had hit the target exactly as ordered. They had no way to know whether anything they had been told about Dora Farms was true. At 4:30 in the morning, Washington time, the phone in the White House Situation Room rang. It was George Tenet, the director of the Central Intelligence Agency. The duty officer picked up. Tenet said 7 words. "Tell the president we got the son of a bitch." The president was not told. Bush was asleep, and the duty officer made a judgment call. A report like that, based on early intelligence from a chaotic strike zone, was not something you woke a wartime president over. Not until it could be confirmed. But inside CIA headquarters, Luis Rueda and his team genuinely believed it. The reports coming out of Dora Farms in the minutes after the bombs fell were coming in fast, and they were coming in dramatic. Rockstar sources on the ground were calling in almost in real time. Someone who looked like Saddam had been pulled from the rubble, blue, gray, receiving oxygen, loaded onto a stretcher, loaded into the back of an ambulance. The ambulance did not move for half an hour. That detail is the one that stuck with everyone who heard it. You do not leave an ambulance sitting still for 30 minutes unless something serious is happening inside. Medical teams working on a patient, security teams deciding where to take him, Or the worst case, an argument over who got to announce the news. Rueda put the odds at better than 50%. He told his superiors they had probably killed Saddam Hussein. Then the reports got stranger. One of Saddam's sons, the rock stars said, had climbed out of the rubble and started screaming, "We have been betrayed." He shot one of the CIA's own sources in the knee. Other sources were injured. The informant network that had delivered the intelligence was bleeding. A CIA officer who had been set up specifically to relay rockstar reporting from inside Baghdad was killed in the strike. Not a casualty the agency could publicly acknowledge, but a casualty nonetheless. The man who had helped make the mission possible had been killed by the mission itself. Washington woke up to a morning that felt like it might already be over. If Saddam was dead, the invasion plan could be rethought. Ground forces were still in position, ships were still in the Gulf, but the political and strategic calculus had just fundamentally shifted. Maybe there was no regime left to topple. Maybe there was no war to fight. Maybe the whole thing could collapse into a negotiation, a surrender, a transition managed from the outside. For a few hours that morning, senior people inside the Bush administration allowed themselves to believe that. Then Iraqi television came back on the air. The broadcast went out around the middle of the day, Baghdad time. Maybe 5 to 6 hours after the bombs fell, a man in an olive green uniform, a black beret, and thick glasses sat at a desk and read from a notepad for 7 minutes. He denounced the American attack. He praised Iraqi resistance. He called Bush a criminal. He looked like Saddam Hussein. Inside American intelligence agencies, analysts started studying the footage almost the moment it aired. Was it live or taped? Was it Saddam or one of his body doubles? Saddam was known to use doubles for public appearances, especially when he felt exposed. Several men had spent years being groomed to look and sound like him, down to the facial tics and hand gestures. The video was not clean. The voice sounded right, but voices can be mimicked. The beret was worn at a particular angle. The glasses were the right style. The rhetoric was familiar, but none of that was proof. The analysts split. Some believed it was Saddam. Some believed it was a double, recorded before the strike, released now to create confusion. Some thought it might be a live appearance by a double, done in a rush, to buy time while decisions were made behind the scenes. The CIA could not definitively say whether the man they had tried to kill 6 hours earlier was dead, injured, or unscathed. Rueda, in later interviews, said that for a window of time in the middle of that day, the agency still held onto the belief that Saddam had probably been killed. The video did not shake them. The ambulance detail was too specific. Something had happened at Dora Farms. Something had, just not what they thought. In the weeks that followed, Vice President Cheney told an interviewer he believed they had gotten Saddam. He was seen being dug out of the rubble and wasn't able to breathe. That was the line Cheney used. Based on the same rockstar reports Rueda had been pushing up the chain, Donald Rumsfeld on March 21st stood at a Pentagon podium and said the strike on the leadership target had been successful. That statement was not softened, it was not hedged, it was delivered as fact. None of it was true, but that would take weeks to prove. And by the time the proof arrived, the war had already started, moved, and reshaped itself around the lie. For now, on the morning of March 20th, senior American officials were walking around believing they had decapitated a regime. And somewhere in Baghdad, a dictator was either dead, doubled, or driving. 10 weeks after the war began, an American colonel named Tim Madere walked into what was left of Dora Farms. He had been there before, twice actually. His job with the Army's 5th Corps was searching sensitive sites, the places where the regime might have hidden weapons, documents, or bodies. Dora Farms qualified on all 3 counts. The CIA had searched it first, right after the invasion. Madere had gone back twice after that, methodical, patient, taking his time. He was looking for one thing in particular: Saddam's bunker. The entire strike had been built around the assumption that it existed. The word Manzul in the rockstar reporting, the decision to use bunker busters, the risk of sending 2 Nighthawks into Baghdad at dawn, all of it had been justified by the belief that Saddam was sleeping in a hardened underground structure that only a 2,000-pound bomb could reach. Madere walked the compound for hours. He climbed into every crater. He studied the foundation slabs of the destroyed buildings. He inspected the one structure still standing, the main palace, hidden behind its wall of electrified barbed wire. The windows were blown out. The interior was a mess. but the building itself was intact, and crucially, nothing underneath it suggested a tunnel, a vault, or an entry point to anything deeper. There was no bunker. There had never been a bunker. When we came out here, Madere told a CBS News crew that accompanied him on his third visit, the primary thing they were looking for was an underground facility, or bodies, forensics, and basically what they saw was giant holes created. No underground facilities, no bodies. Let me sit with that for a moment, because it is the most important sentence of this entire story. The strike that was supposed to end the Iraq War on day one had been launched on the theory that a word in an Arabic translation might refer to a bunker. Nobody had a photograph of a bunker. No source had ever been inside one. There was no blueprint. The best intelligence the CIA had on Saddam's sleeping arrangements that night was a translated word with two possible meanings, and the American military had chosen to interpret it the way that justified the most aggressive response, and they had been wrong. The F-117 pilots had dropped their 4 bombs exactly where they were told to. Reconnaissance photos confirmed that all 4 weapons hit their targets. 3 landed on the far side of the palace wall, collapsing every other structure on the property. 1 missed entirely. The 45 Tomahawks that followed turned the rest of the compound into rubble. What had they destroyed? A family residence, outbuildings, guest quarters, a handful of cars. Nothing that had any military value. Nothing that justified the opening shots of a war. And there had been 1 civilian killed, 14 more wounded. 9 of the wounded were women. 1 was a child. That is the official count, sourced to Baghdad hospitals and the International Committee of the Red Cross. 1 dead civilian, 14 wounded, including a child, for a strike that was built around the moral argument that killing Saddam would save thousands of lives. The ledger opened on the wrong side. On March 21st, 2 days after the bombs fell, Donald Rumsfeld stood at a Pentagon podium and described the operation as successful. The word was not qualified. It was not hedged. A reporter could be forgiven, listening to that briefing, for believing the Secretary of Defense genuinely thought they had killed someone important. The Secretary of Defense knew they had not, or at least he should have. By March 21st, the picture inside the CIA was no longer as clean as the one Rumsfeld was presenting. The Iraqi television broadcast had raised doubts. The rockstar sources who had been so confident in the hours after the strike were starting to walk back their initial reports. Nobody at the agency was prepared to tell the president definitively that Saddam was alive. But nobody was prepared to tell him definitively that he was dead either. Rumsfeld told the world something he could not actually know. 10 weeks later, when CBS national security correspondent David Martin stood in the rubble with Colonel Madere, there was no longer any ambiguity. The bunker did not exist. The bodies were not there. The intelligence had been wrong in the specific way that mattered most. The Air Force general who had commanded the strike told reporters that if Saddam had been at the compound, he would probably have been killed. That was true as a hypothetical. It was also irrelevant. Saddam had not been at the compound, or if he had left hours before the bombs came through the clouds. By the end of 2003, Dora Farms was no longer a family estate or a symbolic ruin. The United States military had built a base on top of it. They called it Camp Steel Falcon. It housed a task force from the 1st Armored Division, and it had some of the tallest guard towers in Baghdad. Soldiers walked patrol around the perimeter. They sat in the towers at night and watched the roads. Some of them probably knew they were standing on the place where the war had started. Most of them probably did not. The first American base of the Iraq occupation was built on the site of the first American strike of the Iraq War. And at the center of it, in the ground where the CIA had sworn there was a hardened bunker, there was nothing. Somewhere in the early weeks of the war, American soldiers started carrying a deck of playing cards. 55 cards printed by the Defense Intelligence Agency, each one showing the face of a wanted Iraqi official. Saddam was the ace of spades. His sons were the aces of hearts and clubs. Chemical Ali, the cousin who had gassed the Kurds in 1988, was the king of spades. What most people did not know is that American pilots had been hunting the faces on those cards from the first night of the war. Dora Farms was strike number 1. It was not the last. Over the 3 weeks that followed, the United States Air Force launched roughly 50 airstrikes aimed at Iraqi leadership, each one driven by time-sensitive intelligence that claimed to know, within a window of minutes, where a specific individual was hiding. Human Rights Watch later counted them. Not one of those strikes killed the intended target. 0 out of 50, I had to read that number twice, because the implication is not just that the intelligence was bad on March 19th. The intelligence was bad across the board. What they killed instead was civilians. On April 5th, 2 laser-guided bombs hit a house in Basra. The target was Chemical Ali. He was not there. 17 civilians from 2 neighboring families were killed, including a 6-month-old baby named Noura. On April 7th, a B-1 bomber dropped 4 satellite-guided bombs on the Mansour district of Baghdad based on a satellite phone intercept. 3 homes destroyed, 18 civilians dead. Saddam had not been there. On April 8th, a bomb intended for Saddam's half-brother Watban destroyed a house in Karata. 6 members of the Jabir family died inside. 1 survived. A 4-month-old girl named Dina, thrown clear of the blast, found the next morning in a neighbor's garden, alive but with broken bones. Watban was captured alive a week later near the Syrian border. There is a reason the same mistake kept happening. The primary tool American intelligence was using to locate senior Iraqi leaders was a satellite phone network called Thuraya. It could pinpoint a handset to within a 100-meter radius, the size of several city blocks. You cannot aim a precision weapon at a several city block circle in a residential neighborhood without killing people who are not your target. The United States did it anyway, 50 times. Mark Garlasco was chief of high-value targeting at the Pentagon during those weeks. He later told the television program 60 Minutes how the math worked. Our number was 30. If you're gonna kill up to 29 people in a strike against Saddam Hussein, that's not a problem. 29 dead civilians. That was the standard approval threshold for a strike on Saddam. No additional sign-off required. And it produced 0 dead leaders. In December 2003, Saddam was pulled out of a hole in the ground near Tikrit. Not by a strike. Not by a satellite phone intercept. A captured prisoner, after months of questioning, pointed interrogators toward the right farm. A human source, months too late to change anything. Dora Farm set the pattern for what followed. Strikes justified by urgency. Targets identified by imperfect technology. Civilians paying the cost of someone else's certainty. The Ace of Spades was captured, tried, convicted, and hanged. The decapitation strategy that was supposed to replace a long ground war turned out to be a ghost hunt with a death toll. I keep thinking about the hours between 3 a.m. and 5 a.m. Baghdad time on March 19, 2003. 2 pilots flying in from Qatar with a weapon that had been signed off for combat use 6 hours earlier. A president alone in a room with his vice president. An informant called Rokan, giving the CIA the best intelligence it would get on Saddam's movements during the entire war. All of it came together that night, and none of it worked. If the strike had gone in at 1 a.m. instead of 4, the war that followed might not have happened. Or it might have happened anyway. We will never know. What we do know is that the Dora Farm strike opened a war that lasted almost 9 years, killed roughly 4,400 American service members, and left hundreds of thousands of Iraqis dead. It all started with an attack that was supposed to prevent it.